You're seeing a pancaking of costs every year that gets built into the rate base that consumers, captive consumers, have no idea what's happening. And a lot of policymakers on Capitol Hill and in state houses don't understand that either.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the premiere edition of the Factor This Policycast, a brand new podcast partnership with National Industry Association, Advanced Energy United, tackling the legislation, rulemaking, and market design that matter to clean energy leaders. Congrats, listener. You're coming in on the ground floor. Great to have you aboard. I'm Factor This content director, Paul Gerke. You can expect to find me moderating this series of discussions, which will feature voices from across the energy policy landscape and spotlight issues shaping the evolution of our electric grid. We're beginning with a topic you may have spotted in recent headlines: competitive transmission solicitation. It's no secret that large-scale, critical electrical infrastructure projects like high-voltage transmission lines cost a lot to build, and they take some time to come online. After all, we're not ordering private taxis for our burritos here. This is complicated stuff, and not many companies can really do the work. About 15 years ago, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, mandated that utilities competitively bid out such projects. But that mandate really isn't being enforced, for reasons we'll get into shortly. New data points to tremendous benefits from competitive transmission, though, including billions of dollars ultimately saved by ratepayers. Detractors argue the bidding process delays timelines, sometimes up to years, and subjects projects to hidden costs. A group of Midwest utilities has even gone as far as asking FERC to halt the bidding process in MISO and SPP territories. On this episode of the podcast, I'm joined by Caitlin Marquis, Managing Director at Advanced Energy United, and Paul Sissio, Chair of the Electricity Transmission Competition Coalition. Both are strong advocates for competitive transmission, and they'll share findings that back them up. We'll discuss that utility request to ban competition outright, talk about FERC's role in all of this, and explore the finer points complicating broader transmission build-out at a time we really need it. Welcome to the Factor This Policycast. Paul, I'd love to start with you. One of the first things you mentioned when I touched base with you about being on the show was the affordability crisis. Everybody's talking about how expensive energy is right now. How does competitive transmission bidding play a role in the affordability crisis, and how much of the affordability issue can we really pin on the cost of transmission?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the invitation. You know, as you have said, we have a serious reliability crisis, because of a multiplicity of things like the Iran crisis. But here today, we're talking about specifically the electricity affordability crisis. The cost of electricity is way outweighing the consumer price index. How much can we pin on it? Let me just back up a minute and tell you that about 4 years ago, we started looking at electricity prices starting to increase, and demand was flat. We started asking questions. Why are we seeing these higher electricity bills? And when we did, we found out that the transmission costs were exceedingly growing at a much faster rate than generation and distribution costs. And when we looked at it, we found out that Order 1000, that was a 2011 rule that FERC issued, said that it was in the public interest that these large transmission, regionally planned projects be competitively bid. In other words, using competition, unleashing competition to drive down costs. But we also found out real quick, we looked at a Brattle study report that said that about only 5% of all the transmission projects in the United States were being competitively bid. And as we started investigating this, we came down to the conclusion that, wait a second, FERC Order 1000 is the law of the land, but FERC was not enforcing it. And so we started asking questions about how can the utilities, how can they get around this law of the land? And in Order 1000, they had a small caveat that said, look, if a company needs a transmission project for reliability purposes, in other words, okay, an emergency, you need to build this really, really quick, then it does not have to be competitively bid. Well, guess what? That loophole became from a small loophole to a large loophole that the utilities have been using ever since to escape competition. And the affordability crisis, building transmission lines is extremely profitable. The utilities, for every dollar that they spend, will receive lucrative transmission incentives from FERC. There's 10 of them. And that results in a return on equity that is between often 10 to 12% for the entire life of the project. But getting more to the heart of the issue, that a lot of people don't understand, policymakers included, is that the initial cost plus the incentives, and then they have to finance that. So there's the cost of financing. When you take the original cost of capital plus the ROEs plus the financing, it literally quadruples the cost of that transmission line for the life of the project. So you're seeing a pancaking of costs every year that gets built into the rate base that captive consumers have no idea what's happening. And a lot of policymakers on Capitol Hill and in state houses don't understand that either. But it is a big deal, and we're seeing a cascade of costs. The rate that Edison Electric Institute is forecasting for transmission spending is at a rate 3 times higher than the 10-year average that we saw. So do we have an electricity transmission affordability crisis? Yes, sir, we do.
Caitlin, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this. It sounds like there's a real opportunity here to leverage competitive bidding to save some money. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on the podcast. So from where I sit at Advanced Energy United, we are a trade association that works nationally, and we represent companies that are developing competitive transmission, as well as a lot of other companies across the energy sector, from competitive generation developers, grid side technologies, distributed energy resources, sort of whole range of technologies. And thinking about how transmission intersects with affordability, I think it's also really important to step back and recognize transmission costs have gone up, but transmission, if it's well planned, if we're building the right transmission, has a lot of consumer benefits. And so it can unlock more affordable generation resources that lower the cost of electricity and can result in net cost savings for customers if we're building the right kinds of transmission, and if we're planning it regionally and independently. And that's what Paul is highlighting, is that we really haven't been doing that in a lot of
Right.
cases. And the transmission that we've been building since Order 1000 was approved by FERC in 2011, roughly 90% of the billions of dollars we've spent on transmission lines has been on lower voltage reliability upgrades, which is not to say that we don't need to be investing in those projects, but has all of that spending been prudent, and have we been uh, taking advantage of the competitive process as much as we could be? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. And so we've seen where competition has been enabled, that it's resulted in all sorts of consumer benefits, cost savings, innovation. Uh, but it hasn't. There are barriers to realizing those benefits based on the way that transmission has been planned and built. So I think keeping it there can be this sort of, as we're thinking about affordability, thinking about ways that we can save consumers money. We also don't want to kind of overcorrect and say, oh, we should be turning away from transmission. We very much need transmission, but we need to be really careful and thoughtful about what we're building and how we're building it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Building the right transmission reduces congestion and reduces consumer costs, and we like that.
And congestion can get pretty pricey. There's been some reports recently about how much congestion on the PJM grid alone was costing. I think it was north of $1 billion in the month of May, according to one third party person looking at the data. Pretty wild stuff. I feel like it's been a minute since I've been in the batting cages, but both of you were tossing me a softball, and I'm not going to just stand here. I'm going to take a cut at it. You were teeing up the data, and there is a lot of data that looks at projects that were competitively bid and not competitively bid, what their timelines looked like, what their costs look like. Paul, do you want to start with what your organization that you chair, ETCC, looked at? And then Caitlin, if you want to talk a little bit about what the think tank R Street just put out recently, as well as any other data points that you wanted to touch on. Paul, but let's start with your organization. What did you guys find when you really looked at these projects?
Yeah. Well, like in PJM, for example, 10 years ago, transmission costs were around 4%. Okay. And now it's around 27% of the total cost of transmission, total cost of electricity. But we looked at, for example, 19 projects that were not competitive. In other words, the incumbent utility built them. And we found that there was an average cost overrun of 84%. So not only did they not deliver the project at the original or estimated or approved cost, but they did not have any cost containment provisions in these agreements, and there were cost overruns. Just those projects cost consumers an increase of $4.8 billion. Now, we looked at uh, 19 relatively recent projects that were competitive, and we saw an average cost reduction of 38%. For those 19 projects, it saved consumers $4.9 billion. So this is real money.
Caitlin, how does that stack up to what R Street found and what you and your organization have learned about the role of competitive bidding?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'll note that there's unfortunately not a ton of data available because of, like we talked about, there's barriers to competition, and also the data is just spotty. But R Street looked at projects that went into service across. Let me make sure I get my years right here. Um, Projects that went in service after January 2018 with costs above 50 million, and they looked at both cost and timelines because I'm sure we'll get into a recent complaint that was filed that's alleging that competition adds time to the process, and they found on both fronts that competition does deliver benefits. So on a cost basis, that on average in the MISO and SPP regions, that competition delivers 30% cost savings relative to incumbent projects on a sort of average basis, and that even when you count the time for competitive solicitation, that competitively bid projects actually come in service faster, which means from the time that the need is identified to the time that the line is delivering electricity and is in service, that timeline is faster. And I think if you think about the way that competition works, this makes sense because there's an incentive, and there's actually in the bidding process built into that opportunities for competitive developers as they're trying to win a project to include cost guarantees and schedule guarantees that then they're held to. And so they have a clear incentive to come in on time and on budget, because they're not going to, maybe they've agreed to an ROE reduction, and so they have a financial incentive as well as a reputational incentive to come in on time and on budget, and that's what we've seen. Of course, there are different projects that run into different hurdles, but on an average basis, and that happens to incumbent projects as well. All of these projects face the same permitting um, and and supply chain challenges. But we've seen the competitive projects often coming in ahead of schedule despite those challenges, and at or under budget. And when they are over budget, the competitive developers often sort of eating those costs and not passing them on to ratepayers.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize something that Caitlin touched on is that when you run through a competitive process, you have utilities that want the business competing. So they sharpen their pencil and they put cost containment provisions in their bid. Quite often, instead of asking for example, a 12% ROE, they'll ask for accept 11 or accept a 10. And as Caitlin points out, many of these competitive bidders will say, okay, I'm going to deliver this project on time. And if I don't, I will take a cost penalty. If you are a monopoly incumbent utility without competition, you have zero incentive to reduce costs. You have zero incentive to put in writing these cost containment and penalties. And that is why we are seeing it's contributing to much higher costs.
I had a conversation with my wife this morning when we brought our daughter to daycare about this very topic, and her initial response, someone completely removed from the energy industry or any part of this conversation, is just, yeah, of course. Wouldn't competition be better in everything? It's like, if Walmart and Kmart were both going to offer you the same item and one of them was going to price it differently, I mean, it's just like anything, right? It seems like common sense. There are nuances to that, of course, but the big sticking point seems to be, what are the real savings here? How does that 30% that R Street found, Paul, how does that square with what ETCC found in terms of like average cost, saved per project?
Very similar.
Yeah.
Very similar, yeah. And also, there was a Brattle report that was done, 4 or 5 years ago, that came up with the same estimate, up to 40% reductions. So, yes, they're very consistent numbers.
And for those who don't follow this space, we're not talking about a $10 million project here. I mean, Caitlin referenced projects north of $50 million, and a lot of these are in the tens or hundreds of millions, if not billions of
No,
dollars.
we're talking billions. Most of these in billions, yes.
Yeah, big projects, and that means big savings. One of the other things that R Street pointed out that I wanted to bring up is that according to their findings, they saw no evidence that competitive transmission actually added time to the timelines. We've seen some data that pushes back at that, and I'll get into that in a minute, but I would love to get your opinions, both of you, about the idea that competition does or doesn't add time. And I know that you're going to tee me up for that utility conversation. We're going to get there in just a second about how some Midwest utilities are pushing back against competitive bidding. But your thoughts on R Street's findings first.
Caitlin?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, similar to cost, developers are building in the competitive process, they're building in schedule guarantees too. So they're committing to delivering something on schedule. I also think, to the conversation that you had with your wife, at just the sort of the logic of competition, if you have this competitive, if you know that you could lose a future project, or you're competing to be able to build these projects, you are incentivized to meet those requirements, and to be in this competitive bidding process, to as Paul said, sharpen your pencil and say, what is the best that I can offer in terms of a schedule guarantee. And what we hear from our member companies that are competitive transmission developers is these guarantees are kind of table stakes now, and so developers are getting creative on what are we willing to offer in terms of what we can commit to.
Mhm.
And like I said, all of these projects are going to face the same challenges with permitting and supply chains. That's not unique to the competitive process or the incumbent process. That's something we need to address as a challenge to transmission development across the board. But if we're sort of isolating the issue of competition, there are some real benefits that it can provide in terms of just the incentive to deliver on or ahead of schedule.
Yeah, ETCC is very grateful for R Street. R Street started this report more than about a year ago is when they started investigating this. And so the timing of them coming forward with the report, the data that Caitlin's talking about, was just really wonderful because of the complaint by the 9 SPP and MISO utilities. But one of the things that I want to get to with R Street, why it took them so long, is the non-transparency of the process. This is a public policy issue. All of this data, transmission costs, should be very transparent because, I mean, after all, policymakers are interested in affordability, and ratepayers are automatically getting these costs passed on to them. Shouldn't there be a form of accountability? Well, what R Street confirms is that there's really a lack of transparency. And that's one of the policy issues that I know my organization is pushing, so that it's easy to see what is happening with these projects.
I'm gl- I'm glad you brought that up, Paul, because that is a big part of this conversation, right? Where it seems like a no-brainer to us, where it's like, well, shouldn't people know about what it is that their money is being used? But as you mentioned, with the loophole you mentioned at the very top, there are inner workings to the underbelly of the machine that we're not privy to, and I'm glad that you're sort of flagging them. We've talked about this complaint now like 3 different times in passing and haven't fully addressed it, so I got to just dive into that pool. So back in April, Entergy, Xcel, and 7 other utilities, the group of 9 that Paul mentioned, lobbied to FERC to stop putting bids in MISO and SPP regions, saying competitive transmission adds 16 to 20 months to timelines. And we know what a soft spot timeliness is right now. And if you were just looking at the executive summary of that report and said 16 to 20 months added, forget competitive transmission. No way we're looking at that as an option. However, lawmakers in those states are pushing back at this and saying, wait a second, something stinks in Denmark, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Montana, Oklahoma, all of them saying, no, we think there's value in competitive transmission. Let's tackle this. What is the utility's real complaint here? Do they have a leg to stand on? And is there any validity to that 16 to 20 month timeline addition? Because that doesn't really seem to jive with the other data we just talked about.
Well, if it's okay, let me jump in first.
Yeah, you're chopping at the bit. Get in there.
I am. I mean, these 9 incumbent monopoly utilities that filed the complaint, what they're really asking FERC to do is to protect them from having to compete. It's asking FERC to protect their future profits. This is a group of utilities that are, I'm going to use the word colluding, to increase electricity prices on unsuspecting, unknowing, captive ratepayers. And the Federal Power Act is the law of the land, and FERC has a responsibility to deliver just and reasonable rates to protect the consumer. And I will be shocked if FERC doesn't step up and see this for what it is.
Caitlin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've talked about in various different ways since FERC mandated competition in Order 1000, there have been efforts, whether it's by passing state right of first refusal laws that give utilities the first right to develop a project, or by finding other ways to circumvent the competitive process. I think this is another example of utilities, really much easier to just get to build everything and not have to compete for it. Their argument in the complaint is this 16 to 20 month. They're focused on the solicitation process, so the process of going out to bid and selecting a project that is unique to the competitive process. They're arguing that window of time that they say is 16 to 20 months. That is untenable in this era of speed to power. They don't tackle, and why I think the R Street data is really important here, and the actual track record that shows that on average, competitive projects, even if you count that solicitation window, still come in faster than incumbent projects. And there's also I think even MISO pushed back. MISO is sort of neutral in this. They're the independent planner. They pushed back on the 16 to 20-month window that does not comport with their sense of how their solicitation process has operated. So I think, you know, we would take issue with the time that they say that solicitation process takes. But then they don't deal with the overall in-service timeline, which is really what you care about if you care about speed to power. And one thing, Advanced Energy United, along with many others, submitted a protest in response to this complaint. And one of the things that we pointed out is we disagree with what the case that they're making, that it's a 16 to 20-month process, that competition slows things down. But if FERC agrees that speed to power is imperative and that we need to be doing more to speed up competition, let's shrink that. We don't think it's 16 to 20 months, but let's shrink that solicitation process rather than saying we're going to get rid of competition, because we already know competition, even when you count that slice of the overall development window, that it speeds things up. So if we could speed that up, the competitive process would be even that much faster than the incumbent process. So it's both sort of, I think, a misguided interpretation of what's happening, that competition is slowing things down by just focusing on the time it takes for solicitation. And then if you want to solve that, you're focused on the solicitation timeline, let's shrink the solicitation timeline and improve that, rather than getting rid of competition and losing both the schedule and the cost benefits um, that delivers.
Yeah, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Caitlin's exactly right. FERC has a toolbox. Well, that's their job. If things don't work, fix it. Now, what I'm saying is the process is working, but the competitive process is working. It's not really delaying delivery of the actual projects. It is resulting in cost reductions. But if in their judgment, if in FERC's judgment, they feel that for speed to power, that they want to speed things up, well, fine. They go back into the policy toolbox and tune things up. I know a number of companies who compete to build these transmission lines, and I asked them the question: can the process at MISO, SPP, and these other regions be improved? Of course. Yeah. Can they be faster? Yes. Um, so, FERC has that toolbox. It's their responsibility for delivering just and reasonable rates, and they have the tools to fix it if they fix it if they feel that it needs to be fixed.
Yeah, to me, that's the low-hanging fruit, is shortening solicitation processes to sort of appease both sides. And if the utilities at that point say, well, it's not short enough, then you really know what the impetus behind their complaint was in the first place. I think that there's an important part of this issue that you just sort of mentioned, Paul, that I had when I was digging into this initially. One of my first questions was, how many companies actually do this? Like, we're not talking about a huge list of people lining up to do massive billion-dollar transmission projects. There's just a handful, and we're talking about the large independent power producers, the NextEras of the world types. So when we're talking about, solicitation windows that might last close to 2 years, it seems a little silly from an outsider's perspective to think that a handful of companies bidding on a project are really going to take that long. Am I wrong in thinking that?
The companies that are competing to build these projects are the utilities. They're not fly-by-night organizations. They are highly qualified. They have built transmission. They have operated transmission. And so they are professionals of what they do. And I, I personally don't know how many of them are out there. I know that probably there's at least, you can count as many on one hand, but maybe Caitlin can add a little color to that.
Total number, but yeah, it's companies like it's non-incumbents like NextEra Electricity Transmission, LS Power, as well as Paul said, some of the the transmission owners compete as well. sometimes have affiliates from other regions. So there are companies with long track records of doing this. It does take time because they're complex projects. So there's going to be time required to design them. And part of the benefit of the competitive process is that you're inviting alternative solutions so you've identified a problem, and then there does need to be a process of checking that from the RTO and verifying that it's going to be reliable and it's going to work and it's going to solve the problem. But all of there's various stages along the process, and each one of those can sort of be shortened. And actually, ironically, one of the stages is sometimes there's information needed from the incumbent transmission owner if there's some component of the project that needs to connect to the system or that includes a non-competitive element. And sometimes that can be a lag in the process where you're just waiting for information from the incumbent transmission developer. So lots of places along the process where things can be tightened. There is inherently some time needed for these companies to develop highly sophisticated, as we're talking about huge projects that can be quite complex, but also can be tightened up.
I wanted to get into FERC Order 1000 just a little more. We've been talking about it as if it's this albatross in the room. Around since 2011, FERC is supposed to be enforcing this. Paul mentioned at the top of the show the loophole that utilities are using to circumvent FERC Order 1000. How can FERC better enforce that rule? And should there be more of a conversation about them busting out that toolkit, as you put it, Paul, and applying it to this problem before it gets way worse? I mean, I write all the time about how we need 2 times the grid we have, 3 times the grid we have, 4 times the grid we have, whatever it is, whatever the pie in the sky demand growth projection you're looking at that day of the week says. And it sounds like a lot of work that we're not doing yet. There was a report not that long ago that said that we need something around 5,000 miles of new transmission lines every year through 2050 in order to meet load growth goals. Well, guess what? We've built 4,000 miles of transmission lines like once in the last 20 years. So that's not happening anytime soon. Forgive me if I screwed those facts up a little bit. But back to the question originally, FERC Order 1000, how do we better legislate, mandate, encourage competition for these big projects and in a timely manner?
Yeah, something I'm going to repeat something that I already said. The Federal Power Act is a law of the land. FERC has the responsibility, the authority to deliver just and reasonable rates for consumers. In our view, rates cannot be just and reasonable unless these transmission projects face competition to reduce costs. FERC needs to close that loophole. Utilities need a reliability project label, but it's too loose. And when it gets to, for example, at MISO and SPP, they're not always abiding by that 3-year rule. For example, SPP just awarded very large projects that were labeled as reliability, but they know they're going to take 6-7 years to build. And they're like 365K. These are the big ones. Does that qualify to escape competition? In our view, no, it doesn't. So they need to tighten this down. They know that they are being gamed, that the consumers are being gamed, and these rates are not just and reasonable, and they need to act.
Caitlin, your thoughts?
Yeah, another point to bring in here is this set of projects that aren't planned regionally that are subject to very little oversight, and there's could be a role for FERC and for independent RTOs to play in that. There can also be a role for states to exercise a little bit more oversight there. So this category of spending on projects that are planned locally but recovered through FERC formula rates that get very little oversight. One interesting development in New England, the region is working on creating an asset condition reviewer for these asset condition projects that are sort of end of life replacement facilities that basically generally just kind of get rubber stamped. The region is now developing an independent entity housed within the ISO to review those projects to give states and consumer advocates a little bit more transparency and information, going back to our conversation about sort of data transparency. So this is one way to make sort of paired with good regional planning to make sure that we're also we're looking at all parts of the transmission planning and transmission spending to exercise good oversight over all of those processes. So that's something that we're watching. It's going through the process. It's related, but not quite the same as there's been discussion of independent transmission monitors, having sort of independent entities at the regional level to checking the homework on these planning processes and making sure that everything's being followed and done correctly. But we think it's a useful step to provide a little bit more transparency around one element of the transmission spend that's currently just not getting. Well, it's getting a lot. It's being talked about, but there's not a lot of transparency and data and accountability and sort of oversight there.
Yeah. There's some fundamental problems, and there was a FERC technical conference about 18, maybe 2 years ago now at FERC, and so there were all these state public service commissioners sitting around the FERC table, and everybody was talking about the need for transmission, but the challenges. And it was astonishing because you had state commissioners saying, either I don't have the time to evaluate the quality and whether the estimate of that project or whether we need that, whether there's more benefits than costs, or they don't have the authority. They don't have the staff. And so, I mean, then you get to the RTOs. Well, that's a different can of worms. There are these RTOs, but they don't have any responsibility or accountability for the cost of power. I mean, they don't have to worry about determining just and reasonable rates. That's FERC, and those entities are paid for by the utilities, and the decision makers at the RTOs, in a large part, are influenced by utilities. Consumers have very little ability to influence the decision making at these RTOs. And so, getting back, all of it comes back to FERC. FERC has the ability to manage this and fix this. And in our view, FERC needs to, in essence, stop protecting the monopoly electric utilities and start protecting the ratepayer. Everybody knows competition works. It's common sense. It's in the American DNA. It is one of the foundational aspects that has made our country successful, competition. FERC knows that. And they have a toolbox of policies that they can make things happen if they want to, and they just got to do it.
Caitlin, one of the other negatives that gets brought up when people push back against the idea of broader competition is hidden costs. Like afterwards, there's going to be some element of cost recovery, or we're going to promise that there's going to be a cap on costs, but actually there isn't, and we're going to have to come back and ask for more money later, and it's going to inflate all of everyone's numbers and make the data that we're looking at even more messy and untrustworthy. In your research and in conversations with the organizations that Advanced Energy United represents, do you find there to be some merit to that there is some black box element to cost overruns when we're talking about competitive transmission?
I mean, I think aside from that, we've talked about general data transparency, and so having poor data, means that
that's a problem.
Across projects. I think everything that we've been talking about with these cost containment measures there can be pre-negotiated exceptions to that when there's something like force majeure or input costs that like the cost of steel skyrockets. Those are going to be things that are going to apply to non-competitive transmission projects too. So can costs still go up? Yes, but is that going to be something that is meaningfully different for competitive projects? And then you still have the benefits. That's a sort of pre-negotiated exemption to a cost cap. You still have the sort of overall benefits of the cost containment measure. So I think still overall, you see benefits from
Mhm.
the competitive process.
We're running out of time here. Got a few minutes left on the podcast. Would love to get into any other part of this conversation that we feel like hasn't received the light of day that it necessarily deserves. Is there a part of this issue that we're glossing over or ignoring?
I can't believe we've been talking about transmission for 40 minutes and we haven't talked about Order 1920. Um,
Okay, here we go. More
because
FERC stuff. Let's do it.
Yeah, because FERC sort of said, okay, Order 1000's been on the books for a while, but we need to make some improvements. We need real long-term multi-value planning that looks across multiple dimensions and looks out over a longer time horizon, and that really builds upon and improves the regional transmission planning process. One thing that relates to competition in that is FERC recognized when they were developing Order 1920, um, and where we are on 1920. If anyone hasn't been following it, FERC issued the order a couple years ago. Regions are currently going through compliance. PJM filed last year. A bunch of MISO, SPP, and a few others just filed this past Friday. A few other, I said New England hasn't even started working on theirs because they're working on a separate process. So we're very much in the messy middle of compliance with Order 1920. But one thing that FERC recognized was that what we've been talking about here, that Order 1000 and the competitive process did drive incentives and resulted in more transmission spend outside of the competitive regional process. Unfortunately, one of the things that FERC did in 1920 to address that was to create a new, limited, but a new federal right of first refusal for um, right sizing projects. So they were trying to create the incentive for utilities to identify places where instead of replacing a line, they could maybe increase the voltage and therefore meet a regional need. We're concerned that this just creates a new loophole for escaping competition, and that a preferred approach would be to enforce the requirement for competition and to play a bigger enforcement role and to make sure that there is greater oversight. We are strongly supportive of Order 1920 and think that it will bring a lot of benefits, but we would like to see that element of it um, uh, improved by the courts. And so that's one thing to watch. I think in Order 1920 is both, is that something that the courts take a look at, but then also as compliance is going on, what are the sort of rules around right sizing? How how much are the RTOs sort of taking a close look at those right sizing projects and requirements? How are they being evaluated? And sort of how is that ultimately implemented? And does that become a new loophole? And the way that we're building a lot of our transmission going forward, because of this new federal right of first refusal that 1920 created.
Yeah, I agree with Caitlin. We are also worried about right sizing being used as a loophole. We were not a fan of the right sizing provision, so we are worried about that. Instead of going in the right direction, it's the wrong direction. I might also add
It's
that,
well intentioned. It's trying to address a real issue,
yeah,
and
yeah.
right sizing can have real benefits. But yeah, concerns about how it ultimately gets kind of implemented and what impacts it can have.
On 1920, the other thing that I will add, there's not a single cost containment provision in 1920. Again, FERC had an opportunity. This is the last FERC. had an opportunity to correct a wrong, and they didn't act. So we were very unhappy with that.
FERC 1920, for those that don't follow the space, mandating long-term planning. I think Caitlin had mentioned it a little bit offhand there, but there might be somebody listening that's like, wait, 1920 does what exactly? But I think I think long-term planning just on its face is a good thing. Whether or not some of the provisions are well-intentioned, clearly up for debate. Is there any other maneuver in that toolbox that FERC could a tool that FERC could pull out of that toolbox that might also improve this process, Paul and Caitlin? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but is there another glaring issue with the larger transmission process that sticks out to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, common sense one is that they could say to the RTOs, ISOs, okay, a competitive process will only last 6 months. Get it done.
Get
Now,
your bids in.
I've been told that PJM has a process at 6 months, but the processes in MISO and SPP can be much longer. Kayla?
Yeah, PJM does have sort of an expedited competitive process that I think is a good model to, you can never copy paste things across regions, but good model to potentially look at, and something that we were looking at in making recommendations in the MISO and SPP complaint in terms of how could you shrink some of the steps along the way in that solicitation process.
We've already established on the first edition of the Factor This Policycast that we do not have a crystal ball handy. Disappointingly so. It would be really nice to be able to just know how this is all going to shake out. But as a sort of bit of parting wisdom for our viewers and listeners, I would love for either of you to sort of weigh in on where you envision the larger scope of this heading as we approach the horizon of some of these quite frankly, preposterous load growth projections that are going to put our grid in a real bind if we don't act in the right ways now. Paul, I'd love to cue you up first, and then Caitlin
Yeah,
second to wrap us up.
for example, that recent complaint by these 9 utilities in SPP and MISO to put a moratorium on competitive processes for 5 years. I mean, I am optimistic that the FERC is going to reject that. I mean, we have the affordability crisis. You have a president that is on that has that. I mean, that complaint is inconsistent with the president's and the data centers pledge to protect the ratepayers. And it's inconsistent with President Trump's executive order to reduce and get rid of anti-competitive regulatory provisions. Does this sound familiar? Okay, and you have every policymaker, it doesn't matter whether you're at the county, the state, the federal level, is concerned about rising electricity. The time is now for FERC to act. So I'm optimistic that this is going to be managed very quickly.
Yeah, I think sort of looking forward on transmission, even stepping back from the competition question, which we do think, as we've talked about at length here, that competition is an important tool to address both speed and cost. But I think, keeping greater alignment on the benefits of competition, or of transmission rather, as we face the speed to power and affordability imperatives. That transmission delivers significant benefits to consumers in terms of, like we talked about at the very beginning, congestion, unlocking more affordable new generation resources, and I think just better alignment on building transmission, but building the right transmission so that we are reducing costs, increasing net benefits, and not adding to already burdened consumers' rates. I think we have a lot of hope that Order 1920 gets us part of the way there. I know I mentioned one piece of that we don't like, but overall, I think it's a really positive development. And what it really is resting on now is the states being able to agree that transmission is worth building and paying for and permitting, and actually getting projects moving forward. So we think transmission is one important element of that, but there's a lot of other pieces that need to fall into place, and sort of alignment on the goals and the benefits is sort of critical across all of those pieces.
It sounds like there's some uncertainty in some of this issue, but one thing I know for sure, if you made it 50 plus minutes into this podcast and you're still listening about the finer points of competitive transmission, you, my friend, are in the right place. This is the Policy Wonk show for you. Paul Sisio, Chair of ETCC, Caitlin Markey, Advanced Energy United, I really appreciate both of you for taking some time out of your day to really get into the weeds on this incredibly important issue. And we look forward to producing more shows just like this about critical electricity policy issues moving forward in our partnership with Advanced Energy United. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, subscribe, leave a little feedback. We would love to know what you think, or maybe share a suggestion for a future episode if you'd like. Until next time on the Policycast, I'm Factor This content director Paul Gerke. Be good, everybody.